This morning, our speaker has asked that we read together from the book of the Judges. Judges chapter 17, verses 1 through 6. Now, there was a man of the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Micah. And he said to his mother, "The 1,100 pieces of silver which were taken from you, about which you uttered a curse in my hearing, behold, the silver is with me. I took it." And his mother said, "Blessed be my son by the Lord." He then returned the 1,100 pieces of silver to his mother, and his mother said, "I wholly dedicate the silver from my hand to the Lord for my son to make a graven image and a molten image. Now therefore I will return them to you." So when he returned the silver to his mother took 200 pieces of silver and gave them to the silversmith, who made them into a graven image and a molten image, and they were in the house of Micah. And the man Micah had a shrine, and he made an ephod and household idols, and consecrated one of his sons, that he might become his priest. In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. We've read the first 16 verses of Judges chapter 17 in preparation for an exhortation titled, "In those days there was no king in Israel," to be presented by our brother Russ Johnson. Brother Russ?
Thank you, Chuck. Very a few slides, but just wanted to let you know that Mark did get the new projector here, and it's definitely working. So that's the test, to see it working. No, that's not quite the test. I've had this up here for a while, and I'm just thinking, what do you see here? Not, it says the encampment of the Israelite tribes in the wilderness. Just in general, what do you see?
12 boxes. The tabernacle's in the middle.
Yeah? I mean, just in general. I mean, you don't have to say, "Oh, yeah, I think that says Simeon down here." I mean, well, that's Ephraim, because you probably can't read it in the back anyway. But I mean, what does it portray to you? Anything? Pardon? I'm sorry. Yeah, square. Yeah. So, what does that tell you in a square? Anything? When they left to go, what did they do? Because there was maybe the Sunday school kids know this, there was a pillar of, anybody know? At night, what did they see? A pillar? Yeah. And what did they see in the daytime? Cloud? Yeah. So when they had to go move, the God told them when they should move and when they should stay, and he told them which tribes should pick up and go first and which ones should follow. Anybody know which one usually went first? Judah. Well, what I see in it, Sherry said a square. I see something that's really kind of symmetric, kind of organized, discipline. It's just, this is the way we're going to do it. God's in the tabernacle, the most holy place. They're surrounding him. The tribes are surrounding him. But I just see it as a really kind of a discipline. You got the directions, there at Dan, Asher, and Naphtali, they were always going to be to what direction? north. And Reuben, they were always going to be south. So it was really disciplined, extremely disciplined. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because what our brother read this morning, it just kind of made a huge contrast to me, because now they're no longer in this status, right? What our brother read this morning is now they're in the land. So this is like, I don't want to say, it is ancient history to us, but in a way, from the passage that our brother read this morning concerning Micah and his family, this is kind of semi-ancient history. That's in the past. So this kind of disciplined area in their lives is not the same anymore. They maybe had the same kind of thoughts that they do that our brother read this morning, but they were set up in this square, as Sherry put it. So we see in this passage that was read this morning that there were 1,100 pieces of silver that Micah had stolen from his mother. And she says, and again, when I was reading this in the past, sometimes I think the author maybe said this about her, like in passing, that's what she said. But this, interestingly, how God can show us some things that, we can skip by, or I have in the past. But this is a direct quote that our brother read this morning from Judges 17. And we're going to be talking just in an overview about these next few chapters, 17, 18, 19, 20, because in my mind, this is just an amazing situation of going from not so good to bad to horribly bad. And I think, why would God put that in there? Why do I need to know some of this stuff? It seems like it's not something I need to know, that they had gotten this bad. But anyway, I want to get back to the quote that she said. So this is her saying this. She said, "I consecrate the silver to the Lord from my hand for my son, to make a graven image and a molten image. Now therefore I will restore it to you." So doesn't that kind of strike you? At least did me. It's like, why would she, the quote being quoted, say, "I'm going to make a graven image," when we know back in Deuteronomy and Exodus, in Leviticus and Exodus, God tells him specifically not to do that. But she seems to not be bothered by that. Exodus chapter 20, verse 4 says, "You shall not make for yourself a graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments." And then later in Leviticus, he says, "You shall make yourselves no idols and erect no graven image or pillar, and you shall not set up a figured stone in your hand to bow down to them, for I am the Lord your God." So here we are, again seeing that his mother quotes that she's making a graven image. Well, I'm going to kind of take license to that a little bit, because you read through that, or I do, and it's like, well, that doesn't apply to me. And I don't get that. Why would you do that? But I can kind of see this. So again, this is Russ's, view of how this happened. So here goes. So I'm the mother, and I'm thinking, well, my son, he stole from me, and I didn't know he stole from me. Maybe I suspected he stole from me, but he stole from me. But he gave it back. This is a wonderful thing that he's given this back. And it's so wonderful that I really want to do something for the Lord. I really do. Because I want people to know that people can change. Even my son can change. And therefore, I'm going to put together this image that people can see, and they know that God exists. So Is there anything wrong with that? I mean, the intent is certainly there. I mean, I don't know that that's the case. Again, this is my version, but I could see where I could do something like that, make something up like that. But knowing that, in fact, it's not right. One of the things, too, that's here that kind of flashes me to the New Testament with Ananias and Sapphira was, how many pieces of silver did she lose? Was it 1,100? How many did she give back to God in this graven image? 200, right? Well, what happened to the 900? Well, I'm not really going to go there, but I can see that there's problems here, and I think we all can see that there's a problem. But I don't think this is, my rendition story. I don't know that it's necessarily the worst rendition that could be made up, because we know that when Saul did with the Amalekites and Agag, remember that story, we know that he uses some kind of a similar type response to Samuel when he sees all of these, the king Agag coming back, and he was supposed to be destroyed, and he sees all the animals. But the reply that Saul gave to Samuel was, Samuel says to Saul, when he's kind of condemning him for what he does, he says, does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifice as much as obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. So essentially we see Samuel saying, you need to do what God tells you to do. But Saul's reply is kind of something that I would, reply potentially. He says, but the people took some of the spoil, sheep and oxen, the choicest of the things devoted to the destruction, to sacrifice to the Lord, your God at Gilgal. So they did, we took that cattle because we wanted to sacrifice that to, he says, your God, Samuel. But he's saying, what's so wrong with that? I kind of went above and beyond what I was supposed to do, and I went and did that. So we see this situation that seems to be, with Micah, not good. We see that I think there's precedent for other people using that excuse. Like I said, the type of excuse that I could use. But later in that same chapter, that 17, that was read, Micah goes on, and he meets a Levite priest. Remember, he meets a Levite priest, and he says to him, to the priest, Micah says, stay with me, and be with me a father and a priest, and I will give you 10 pieces of silver a year, and a suit of apparel, and your living. And the Levite was content to dwell with the man, and the young man became to him like one of his sons. And Micah installed the Levite, and the young man became his priest, and was in the house of Micah. Then Micah said, now I know that the Lord will prosper me because I have a Levite as a priest. So saying, I talked to this Levite, I now have in my house this Levite as a priest, and he's going to use these images that I have, graven images, and we're going to have worship. It's like, where is this going? So it goes from these pieces of silver that were stolen, and the mother says, I made graven image, and now we see that Micah's taking it another step further. He's saying, I'm going to hire this Levite to be my priest. And you might ask yourself the question, well, why would he do that? We'll get to that later, but pop in your mind. Why does he need to hire a priest for him locally? So now we get into the next chapter, 18, and we'll just talk to that. So we see that he's hired this priest, and it's kind of going downhill. In the next chapter, another player is introduced into this chapter, and it happens to be the tribe of Dan comes into this. And Dan is there because they're spying out the land, right? They're spying out the land, and I'll try to move this slide here. So again, maybe come back to this and talk to this. I think you all have these in your Bible. A map. And again, I'm going to just contrast this slightly. But remember all the organization that we saw on the first slide? Well, this organization that we saw kind of now changes, right? And I'm not saying it's a bad thing, because I don't think it is a bad thing. I think it's a good thing. I think they needed the order in their lives because they were going to go into the land. And in the land, I think they needed that order to be able to talk to their families and those they came in contact with to bring them to God. But if you take a look at this particular slide, Dan is said they're spying out the land. And if you see where Dan is, anybody see where Dan is? But it's right here, right? It's the Philistines here, and then there's Dan. Does anybody, maybe the Sunday school class, there was a really strong man. He was a pillar of a man. Anybody know who that might be? Huh? Samson, right. And you know what? He was from Dan. He was a Danite. And I'll give a little plug for our weekend coming up in the fall. But as one of the brethren a couple years ago was at the weekend, he was talking about Solomon and Delilah. And he mentioned something that didn't really dawn on me. But, you know, who was helping Samson combat the Philistines? Was it his own people? He was like a loner, right? He was like a one-man army. And so when you think about it, it's like, no, he wasn't being helped by his kinsmen. As a matter of fact, they were like, let's turn him over to the Philistines. We don't want to deal with him. So I don't have my pointer here, but this is Dan, and this is where he at. But now this says Dan up here. Do you see that? I don't know if you can read that. That says Dan up there, right up there. But what are they doing up there? They're spying out the land. Well, I thought, isn't that where they're supposed to be? That's where it says. That's where they came in. But that's not where they're at. They're way up north now. So they're saying we're spying out the land. And in my mind, it's like saying, well, didn't Caleb and Joshua do that? They had to spy out the land. We're going to do the same type of thing because they really couldn't fight against the Philistines. They kind of gave up. You know, after Samson left, I guess it was over for them. So they're out spying out the land, as they say. And they come up to this city, and it says Dan way up north there, but actually it's a city called Laish. And these are people in Laish that is a really quiet city. And here's how the story intertwines with the previous one. This tribe of Dan says to the Levite priest that was hired by Micah, hey, wouldn't it be better for you to be working for us, a tribe, more people? And of course he says, yes, I think that would be wise. I'm going to do that. And so that's what ends up happening. And they look at this city, and the city is a quiet city. And the original Dan was one of the 12 members, remember, of the tribes of their father Jacob. And Jacob has something to say about Dan when he blesses all of his different children. And he says, Dan shall be a serpent by the way, an adder in the path, that biteth the horse's heel so that its riders fall backward. So, you can see, to me it's a snake in the grass. So you can see, he says, yeah, my son Dan, he's the kind of guy that when a guy's riding a horse down the road, he's going to knock that guy right off the horse. That's who he is. And that's what he ended up doing. He goes into this town of Laish, and he now has his Levite priest with him, and he says, I'm going to take over this town. And I thought it might be, that should read from Proverbs chapter 1. It says a little bit about this, beginning in verse 10. This proverb says, My son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. If they say, Come with us, let us lie in wait for blood. Let us wantonly ambush the innocent. Like Sheol, let us swallow them alive and whole. Like those who go down to the pit, we shall find all precious goods. We shall fill our houses with spoil. Throw in your lot among us, and we will all have one purse. If my son, do not walk in the way with them. Hold back your foot from their paths. For their feet run to evil, and they make haste to shed blood. For in vain is a net spread out in the sight of any bird. But these men lie in wait for their own blood. They set an ambush for their own lives. Such are the ways of all who get gained by violence. It takes away the life of its possessors. So that's kind of what they decided they were going to do. And they were kind of building their own little empire. Well, one of the questions that I would have here that I talked a little bit earlier about before is, what should they have? Where should they been going? They're saying, hey, you know what? I think if we have our own priest, that'll work pretty good. And we hired this guy, this Levite. But if you look in the chapter, you'll see that, and I don't know if you can see it on here. Not sure I can, but it's Shiloh, which I think is right up. I can't see it exactly on here. It's S-I-L-O on here, but it's S-I-L-O-H. But this is about where they should have been worshiping. Everybody needed to be worshiping at Shiloh. But they said, nope, we're going to do it up at our end. And so if you kind of like fast forward a little bit to the time of David, and when Solomon's done, we have a split, we know, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, and think of where one of those places is that they worshipped in the northern kingdom. Was Dan. It was one of those places. So you can see there's a history there in Dan that takes that is problematic. So in the time of Jeroboam, they decided to continue on with that history that we're talking about in the time of Judges. So we can see in this time of Judges, things are going south. They're going from Micah with his idol to, or his mother saying, let's make some graven images, and then Micah hiring the Levite priest, and then now Daniel saying, well, I'll hire that priest over you because it's better for him to be over a whole tribe than just one family. So then as we get into the next chapter, it's starting, the snowball is rolling downhill. It's getting even worse. In the next chapter, I'm not going to get into all the detail, but this has to do with a guy and his wives going to the city of Gibeah. And he's saying, well, I don't really want to, I want to be with my people, with the Israelites, because some of these other people aren't too good. So he says, I'm going to stay in this town at Gibeah. Well, we know what happens there. It just gets horrible. His concubine is mistreated, and it really starts to go downhill for the whole area of Israel. So, like I said, it's just getting worse as it goes along. And it uses words in the 19th chapter. It says, as they were making their hearts merry, behold, the men of the city, base fellows, beset the house round about him, beating on the door. And they said to the old man, the master of the house, bring out the man who came into your house, that we may know him. And I'm going to read the rest of this, but what does that sound like? What does that verbiage sound like? It sounds like another event that happened before. That was Sodom and Gomorrah, right? So it's like, I don't think these words here were just made up. These words were to say, yeah, that's where they're going. So they, picture that previous slide, very organized, God telling them what they want, and now they get into the land, and now they're just starting to just do what they want. And then it gets even worse, because then they decide, well, Benjamin is the culprit. The tribe of Benjamin is the culprit. And so they decide, well, we're just going to go wipe them out. So here's Benjamin here, and the rest of them say, they've gone so far south, we're going to kill them all. But then they realize they can't do that. And they start making other rationale up. They lose thousands of people, tens of thousands of people. And then they find out they don't have enough brides for the remaining Benjaminites, that the remnant that is being saved. And they come up with another way they make up as they go along to provide wives for them. And so, again, I say to myself, why are these chapters in the Bible? I mean, they just go from bad to really, really worse and horrible. Well, Jeremiah chapter 17 says something that we all know. He says, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? I, the Lord, search the heart. I try the reins, even to keep every man according to his ways and according to the fruit of his doings. So Jeremiah goes on to say, he's saying, the heart is deceitful. We make up stories as we go along. We make it so that it fits what we want to do. So I think this story is there because it's a story about me. It's a story about us. Well, we can't be that bad. Well, I think we can be at times. Things that go through our mind, things that we believe, the action that we think ought to be taken, it's not the right thing to do. And so Jeremiah is warning us, saying, nobody in this room, everybody can be in a situation where they deceive themselves about something that's going on. And so we don't want to be that person that makes molten images. We don't want to be the people that, I didn't get into this, but into Israel that made a vow that said, we are not going to allow our daughters to marry anybody in Benjamin. Well, they made a vow and it ended up hurting them. Made things really difficult. And, that's things that we do in our own minds. We thought, well, I'm never going to do this again. Not me. It's not going to happen to me. So, as we read this morning, and I think last time I was here we were talking about some things in Sunday school, and I think Beth brought up there was no king in Israel. And there wasn't a king in Israel at that time. And personally, I always kind of wondered about that. Why bring that up? Because we know later that God is the king of Israel. Samuel says that. When they want a king, he says, you're the king, but they want someone else. So we know what happened then. We know that Saul became the king, and he was just like another Adam. But it appears to me that as I look through this, that God needs to bring his people to a king. And we know in that particular case, when Saul failed, just like Adam failed, that God chose someone that nobody else chose. And that happened to be a little guy that was out tending the sheep. Remember, Samuel says to the father Jesse, do you have any more sons? Because all the ones I've seen so far, they're not it. So who was that son out tending the sheep? David, right. So David was the one. He was the one that God said, I need to bring my people through him. He has to be an example for my people so that they can grow. And I'm not going to get into the detail of his life, but we know how David grew and how he brought the people to him. But David himself knew that he wasn't qualified enough, because he says in the 24th Psalm, who shall ascend the hill of the Lord, and who shall stand in his holy place? Who has clean hands and a pure heart? Who does not lift up his soul after what is false, and does not swear deceitfully? He's not deceived. He will resolve blessings from the Lord and vindications from the God of his salvation. Such is the generation of those who seek him, who seek the face of God, who seek the face of the God of Jacob. So just as David was this type, that God is showing the people that they need to come to a king, and not a king like Saul, but a king like David, we know that David said, who's got the clean hands? Well, Peter tells us who it is in 1 Peter chapter 2. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, somebody to follow, that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, no guile was found on his lips, and when he was reviled, he did not revile in return. And when he suffered, he did not threaten, but he trusted to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. That we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed, for you were straying like sheep, but have now returned to the shepherd and guardian of your souls. So Peter's telling us we stray like sheep. I think Peter strayed like a sheep. He knew from first-hand knowledge. And so we have Peter telling us this, but we also know that Pilate said this. So this is like a third party is saying, well, not only is Peter right, no guile was found on his lips, but even the world says the same thing. Pilate in Luke 23 then called together the chief priests and the rulers and the people, and he said to them, you brought me this man as one who has perverting the people. And after examining him before you, behold, I did not find this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither did Herod. So by the way, he went down to Herod. I didn't see anything. Herod didn't see anything because he sent him back to us. Behold, nothing deserving death has been done by him. I will therefore chastise him, and I'm going to let him go and release him. But they all cried out, away with this man, and released to us Barabbas, a man who had been thrown into prison for an insurrection starting in the city and for murder. Pilate addressed them once more, desiring to release Jesus, but they shouted, crucify him, crucify him. And a third time, this is the third time, he says to them, why? What evil has he done? I have found no crime deserving death. I will therefore chastise and release him. I'm going to release him again. This is the second time I'm telling you. But they were more urgent, demanding with loud cries that he should be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate gave sentence that their demand should be granted. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, whom they'd asked for. But Jesus he delivered up to their will. He released the man. Who was the man he released? Barabbas. What was he? Well, he was a murderer, right? And insurrection. So he had to be somebody that was going up against the Roman Empire. You can just tell what kind of a situation Pilate was in, because release guys that are trying to bring your empire down, the Roman Empire down. But he did. And not only was he just someone who was trying to bring the Roman Empire down, he was a murderer too, on top of it. Well, I don't know about you. I kind of don't like to put myself in the case of Barabbas as a murderer. But you know what? That's kind of what happened, right? We're kind of murderers, not in the respect that we killed somebody, but we commit the same type of thing. And he was let go. You have to think a little bit that perhaps he was in the same holding cell in jail with Jesus, the two of them together. It doesn't say it was the case, but you could almost kind of guess that might have been the case. So Barabbas ends up being that scapegoat that was talked about in Leviticus 16, where it says, and Aaron shall offer the bull as a sin offering for himself, and shall make atonement for himself and for his house. And then he shall take the two goats and set them before the Lord at the door of the tent of meeting, and Aaron shall cast lots upon the two goats, one lot for the Lord, and the other for Azazel. And Aaron shall present the goat on which the lot fell for the Lord, and offer it to as a sin offering, but the goat on which the lot fell for Azazel shall be presented alive before the Lord to make atonement over it, that it may be sent away in the wilderness. So we never know what happened to Barabbas after that. I don't think. There's nothing in there unless somebody knows. But, here's a guy a man, evil that was let go. You wonder what went through his mind thinking, how did this ever happen that I got let go from something I've done so horrendous? And it's the same for us. How can we be given grace for something that we obviously can't deserve? But God is willing to provide that through his Son. So we might ask, did he convert like the thief on the cross? I guess we will never know. But we're here today to examine ourselves, just like Jeremiah said about the heart being deceitful, that God can examine us. He can examine our hearts and our reins, and he can, I think you could talk once about the reins being the kidneys. He can look deep down inside our very fabric, and he knows what we're up to and what we're thinking. So we have to examine ourselves when we come around the table at this time. Because as John tells us in his first chapter, verse 29, look, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. And so we have to ask ourselves, do we have a king in our life? Do we let him into our life? Or are we like those in the Old Testament? Have we become a law unto ourselves? Do we do what we want to do? Do we make a graven image and say, you know what, I think God fits into that pretty nicely. I like the way he fits into the graven image I've made. But we have, at this time as we come together, a really wonderful opportunity to be freed of the ugly sin that is in our lives and be able to get eternal life through the grace that comes through his sacrifice, and that we can come to our Father in heaven through Jesus.
Thank you, Brother Russ. I'm glad we have a recording because my pen just didn't move fast enough. We'll continue this morning by singing together hymn 240. Hymn 240.
And with his hand
when the time comes, I'd like to ask our brother Dan to offer thanks for the bread and brother Matthew to offer thanks for the wine. Well, I had too many notes to mention this morning, but I think I can call out a few of the lessons that we learned. The first one is that people do what makes sense to them. They do what makes sense at the time. So we consider some of the examples from this morning. The son, having taken all that money, felt bad about it, and he gave it back to his mother. Makes sense. The son would have some empathy for his mother. The woman did what made sense to her. She was thankful that she'd received this money back, and her thought was that she should give thanks to God. Somehow she didn't know what the law was or know about the living God of Israel. Or maybe it was just like in our own day, everybody blah, 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 and then we'll go off and do what we did yesterday. And then we've got the tribe of Dan. We considered how Solomon was fighting the Philistines, but he was alone. Where were his tribesmen behind him? They weren't there. One thing that we didn't bring out is, why would the tribe of Dan have to stand alone? Aren't there 12 tribes? Shouldn't they all be standing together as a nation to hold out the Philistines? But if you imagine that you're constantly going to be harassed by men with swords who take your stuff, who kill your people, it makes sense. Maybe you want to move someplace a little quieter. The other lesson is the trend is set early. We see this in Scripture again and again and again. What we see in Judges with the tribe of Dan played itself out on a grander scale later on when the 10 tribes separated off from Judah and Benjamin. And even earlier than that, when we dig down for the Jacob's blessings to the 12 tribes, goes all the way back to Genesis. If you see what happens in Genesis, it just gets magnified as time goes on. So we've got what some call the rule of first occurrence. You start with a little hint and it grows. Proverbs calls that a path. We think we're taking one step off to the left, and in fact, we're on a path that goes a long way. And if we look down the path, we might not like it. A third lesson, we are not immune. It's much easier to imagine that our speakers have overcome sin in its entirety and are delivering a message, from Jesus, which by the Spirit I think often happens. However, as our brother pointed out, we all have a human heart. We all have the capability for wickedness. That's what it is to be a mortal creature of flesh. The heart is deceitful above all things. So, it's not just them. The reason that we look at them, the son, the woman, the tribe, the people, what they did, is not just ancient history. That's how people are. That's how people are now, and that's what people do. And finally, our brother asked, do we have a king in our own lives? That's what comes first, is who is the king in our lives? That's why we keep looking at what Jesus said and at what Jesus did, because if Jesus is the king in our lives, then that's very important. It's more important than all the blah, blah, blah that we get here and there. We have a king. God gave us a king that's called his beloved, just like David was his beloved. but the King's name is Jesus. He overcame the nature of his flesh. He had the same flesh we do. He had the same human heart, but he overcame it because he obeyed his God and Father. And because of that, Jesus was raised from the grave, immortal, and now he's ascended. He's been transformed. He will never see corruption again. He's not dragged down by the nature of the flesh. Our King is perfect and sinless and incorruptible. And the King in our lives is worth following. I'd like to ask our brother Dan to lead us in thanks for the bread.
Dear Father, we thank you now for this reminder of this bread as Jesus' body. For we all need to be strengthened by your Son to become like him. We've been reminded today that we all in many ways do whatever it is that's right in our own eyes. It's because we forget that we have a King. So we thank you for the reminders now that we do have a King, the greatest